Maar ik dan al
This is our process. I don't know what to do. Try on your phone. I don't know how I can change the volume. Well, anyway, we don't need a noise. So we started last lecture with swarms, which are simulations of animals that move together. Here is a real swarm. Previously, we saw a simulated swarm. It's just to show how closely the simulations resemble the real thing. So to situate the whole idea again, we're in the chapter on complex adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems are considered as collections of agents. Each agent individually is autonomous, has its own goals, has its own condition action rules. It senses particular conditions, it reacts to these conditions. But by reacting on the conditions, it also changes the conditions of the other agents, which means that the agents, even though initially they're autonomous, they will influence each other, and therefore the different agents will interact. And out of these interactions, we see all kind of interesting phenomena of self-organization. Swarming is one of the simplest ones to model, but swarming is something that is very relevant for the real world. In nature, we do see that swarming. So let me give you another example of swarming now with fish. I don't know how to change the volume. We don't need the sound. So here what you see is sharks swimming to a shoal of fish. And so what is the swarming rule? Fish in the shoal stay together, they move more or less in the same direction, but of course they evade predators, in this case the shark. So whenever the shark comes close, the fish go away. In this case, yeah.
I think that's definitely real.
So here we have a simulation of the same kind of thing. So the green things are like the fish in the shore, and the red thing is like the shark. And you see, it looks very much the same. So that's an example of how computer simulation with agents allows us to model and simulate realistic complex systems. Of course, this is not very complex. The rules are very simple. The behaviors may look complex in some degree, but they are not that complex. So let's talk about some more complicated simulations of these systems. And we come in the domain of artificial life. So artificial life is a very interesting topic. It is the idea, can we make something like living organisms evolve in a computer simulation? Well, how could we do it? Well, the principles of evolution are pretty simple. You have variation, you have selection, you have reproduction, you create some kind of a virtual creature, you put it in some kind of an environment where it needs to survive, you give it certain rules, and then you allow these rules to undergo variation and selection. Variation means that from time to time you make small changes in the rules. Selection is you check whether your new virtual creatures are doing well in their environment. If not, you eliminate them. If they do well, if they are fit, you keep them and you let them reproduce. So that's a general principle. It's very simple, but of course there are an infinite number of possible variations on that. So I'll start with kind of very simple variation. This was one of the earliest simulations in this domain. It's called sugar escape. The idea is that you have something like a cellular automaton. We saw that these cells are like little squares, a space subdivided in little squares. In a square, there can be an agent, and the agent can move to one of the neighboring squares. So how are we going to simulate living agents in there? Well, what do living agents need to survive? Well, they need food. So what do? You distribute food to some of the cells, and you let the agents find the food, eat the food, and then continue finding more food. And then you can have the rule that those that find a lot of food, they reproduce. Those that don't find a lot of food, they die. And like that, you can have the beginning of a natural selection in there. So that was one of the earliest simulations. I hope it will work. I'll show you a video of it. So it's called the sugar escape simulation. So the green is the amount of food, which in this case is called sugar, and the agents, they're looking where there is food, and you see whenever they eat the food, it becomes less green, but there's kind of the assumption that it's like grass, it grows, so the food recovers. But you see there are two patches with a lot of food, and one of the agents now has found the second patch, start eating there because the agent eats a lot. Now some others find it, and then you will see the number will increase because they are eating a lot, so they are multiplying, and like that you can kind of have a simulation of organisms in an environment. So that's an extremely simple simulation, but now you can think of all kinds of possible variations. And most generally, what do we need? We need creatures that try to survive. In order to survive, they need certain resources. In this case, it was this supposed sugar that is on the landscape, but there can be all kind of much more complicated situation where there are resources that they need to compete for, and then you can make it so that they can, for example, the one can take food from the other, or the one can even eat the other, because you assume that an agent that has eaten food contains food contains energy, so in principle it can be eaten by another one. So you can have a whole ecosystem evolving with the equivalent of herbivores, the one that just eat the food that grows, carnivores, the one that eats the other agents that eat the food, parasites who don't eat the full agent but steal some of their food. So you get the whole ecosystem, and that there are, of course, endless number of variations you can do, but it gives you an idea of how real living organisms function. So that is the whole point of this complex adaptive systems modeling. You start with agents. Each agent has very simple rules, which in this case means you want to survive by eating enough food. And then you invent variations, you create variations so that the agents can vary their strategies of how they get the food. And then you see that agents differentiate in different species. Different species, the one becomes a predator of the other, the one becomes a parasite of the other. So you get a whole ecosystem of increasingly complex species. Now, I'll show you one other video which is less abstract in the sense that this was a video that was intended to simulate behaviors of living animals, but behaviors in the first place movement. So instead of this two-dimensional landscape, which is very simplistic, now the author had created a three-dimensional space, and the three-dimensional space that had certain physical laws in it. So if you want to move on land, what counts is gravity. If you want to move in water, in liquid, then gravity doesn't play a role, but the resistance of the liquid plays a role. So what the author did is he created three-dimensional virtual creatures that were supposed to move as efficiently as possible either through water or on land. But he didn't specify how they should do it. So what he did is he took simple elements, blocks. The blocks are attached to each other, and the blocks can move. Like you can have two blocks that can move like that, or that can move like that, or that can move like that. So what he did is the elements are blocks, the blocks can move, and there is the equivalent of a nervous system. That means that there is some kind of a network connecting the blocks that says, if this block does that, then the other block should do that. So that was the only thing he started with. So initially, random blocks, random between blocks, random nervous system, that means random rules of how the blocks move. But then the selection criterion was how well does the creature move in the simulated environment. And those that move well, they got fitness, that means they were selected, they could reproduce with variations. The ones that didn't move well were eliminated. And then you can let the simulation run, and I'll show you now the video of what came out of that. Come on.
This demonstration shows virtual creatures that were evolved to perform specific tasks in simulated physical environments. Swimming speed was used to determine survival. Most of the creatures are results from independent evolutions. Some develop strategies similar to those in real life. Once they're evolved, multiple copies of these creatures can be made and simulated together in the same environment. The next group of creatures were evolved for their ability to move on a simulated land environment with gravity and friction. Some simple solutions with just two parts were found. Some seemed like they could use some assistance, while others were fairly efficient, such as this rowing-like behavior. Here is an odd cousin of the previous. A mutation caused him to tumble. Some creatures evolved to incorporate contact sensors in their control systems. Here is another inchworm-like creature that tends to go in circles. This was actually a creature first evolved for its ability to swim in water, then later put on land and evolved further. A successful sidewinding ability resulted. Here is one with a hopping style. The protrusions on its arms seemed to help prevent it from tipping over. This was the fastest, with a successful galloping-like stride. This group was evolved for their jumping ability. This group was evolved for their ability to adaptively follow a red light source. The resulting creatures are now being interacted with. A user is moving the light source around as the creature behaves. This one seems to flail randomly, but somehow still manages to approach the light. Perhaps it is mean to move the goal away just as it arrives. Here is one that has propeller-like fins which are tilted depending on the direction of the light. It can adaptively swim up or down very well. This final group of creatures was evolved for their ability to compete for control of a green cube. The creature closest to the cube at the end of the simulation is the winner. Here, a strategy first arose for simply tumbling towards the cube. Then one learned to block out his opponent. But then later, one learned to overcome the obstacle by climbing over it. Some pinned down their opponents. Some covered the cube with protective arms. Others simply unfolded onto the cube. The success of a strategy is often highly dependent on the opponent. Here is a hockey-playing creature, which takes the cube away and wins by a large margin. Here are two similar hockey strategies battling it out, with appropriate gestures. This crab-like creature walks well, but often continues past the cube and instead seems to prefer beating up on his opponent. Against the arm, the crab seems to simply walk away. A successful strategy is this two-arm technique that swipes quickly in from the side and moves the cube over to a second arm. These are the final rounds of competition amongst the overall best. Finally, the seeker arm goes against the side swiper, but the cube is just out of reach.
So the name below, Carl Sims, is the computer artist who actually made that simulation. So that's why I show it, because it's not just interesting from a scientific point of view, it's also interesting from an aesthetic point of view to see what kind of behaviors can evolve. So one of the things we can learn from that is that evolution could in principle have different results than the one that we know. Some of these creatures were swimming in ways that we don't know any creature to swim, or were moving, like toppling over, the way we don't know any creature to move. Come on. So that's the domain of artificial life. That's one of the applications of these complex adaptive systems. Another one is what sometimes is called artificial societies, or simulation of social systems. So it's again the same principle. We have a number of agents. Each agent has certain rules for how it behaves. These rules are aimed at achieving something. In the case of life, the main thing to achieve is to get enough food. In the case of societies, the idea is that the agents can somehow make profit. They can collect money or happiness or satisfaction or utility. The name doesn't matter, but they have certain things that they want to have, and they want to have as much as possible for it. So how can you now evolve something like a society in there? Well, there is a very simple way of describing social interaction. Too simple, but interesting enough that you can find a lot of things about it. It's called game theory. So game theory is inspired by games like, for example, chess or checkers or card games. That means games in which you typically have two opponents, each in turn makes a move and tries to win the game. So the idea is by interacting, each of them tries to get as many points as possible when playing the game. So originally the theory of game theory was proposed by a mathematician and an economist, and it's still used a lot in economy when people make transactions. One offers something to buy and the other needs to offer some money. It's kind of like a game where they both try to make profit. So game theory is typically modeled mathematically. They try to calculate what is the best possible strategy to get the most money. But in this case, we are not looking at so much as a game between two agents, but lots of agents where the different agents play against each other at different moments, which is kind of more like a society. And one of the games that has been most often used, it's called the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma is a game that is a bit, you might say, vicious in the sense that you can cheat in it, and if you cheat, you win more than if you play fair. So what are the three possible, what are the possible ways? So each agent has two moves. One of the moves is called cooperate, that means being nice, and the other one is called defect, that means cheat. And the rules are such, if both agents cooperate, they both gain. They both gain, but not a lot. If both agents defect, they don't gain, they don't gain anything. But if one agent cooperates and the other one defects, then it's the cheater that will get the biggest reward. So that means that if everybody cheats, everybody loses. If everybody cooperates, everybody gains. But if one cheats and one cooperates, then it's the cheater that will be doing the best. So there is always a temptation to cheat. So that's the famous prisoner's dilemma game. And if you wonder where the name comes from, it's a hypothetical situation. Imagine that you have two people that have together committed a burglary, and the police catches them and puts them in jail. But the police doesn't have enough evidence to keep them in jail, so they propose to each of the prisoners an option. They speak to one prisoner alone and they say, if you give us evidence about the other guy, you will get out and the other guy will get the full punishment. But if both of them give evidence against the other guy, well, then they both get some punishment, but less. So cooperating in this case would mean that they don't give evidence, to the police. While cheating means that the one cheats on the other and gives evidence, and the one that cheats gets out free because the police says you have given evidence, we let you out. So that's where the original name comes from. But it's not important to remember that example. What you need to remember, it's a game in which cooperation pays if everybody does it. But if one cooperates and the other one cheats, it's the cheater that gets the benefit. So now how can we apply that in this kind of agent simulation? It started originally with a tournament organized by a political scientist, Robert Axelrod, who was one of these founders of this complex adaptive systems movement. So what he did was he invited all the game theorists that he knew, all the people who were looking at game theories, to send in a strategy to play that game. And then he programmed on the computer different agents, each using one of these strategies, and he randomly let these agents play each other, so that each agent would, after a while, have played against all the other agents. And then the point was, which agent, which strategy makes the most gain in the end? And it turned out that the winning strategy was actually pretty simple, because these were very smart people. Some had thought about very sophisticated strategies of first cooperating and then cheating and then cheating again if even if this and that happens. So they had made very complicated strategies. But the simple strategy, the simple strategy that one was called tit for tat. And the tit for tat strategy starts by cooperating. If the other one defects, then it defects as well. So that means tit for tat. If the other one is nice, it's nice. If the other one is not nice, it's also not nice. It's also called reciprocal altruism. The tit for tat agent does the reciprocate of what the other agent does. If the other agent cooperates, both of them cooperate, they continue cooperating, everybody's happy. If the other agent defects, he stops cooperating, which means he will no longer be taken advantage of, which means that the cheater doesn't get much benefit. So tit for tat was, generally speaking, the best strategy, but let's now turn it into an evolutionary tournament. So let's assume that the different strategies can reproduce with variations, and that the ones that make the most gain are the ones that have most offspring. What do you see? Well, since tit for tat is the one that makes most gain, tit for tat starts dominating. All the others make less gain, so in the end, selection will keep just tit for tat. But now variations, well, assuming that tit for tat is the one that's dominating, so all the agents are playing tit for tat, which means they are all cooperating with each other. Now you can have a strategy, a mutation, that always cooperates. So it would have a rule that says cooperate no matter what. As long as its neighbors are all playing tit for tat, they will also cooperate, so everybody cooperates, so everybody's happy. But now imagine that one of the mutants has a cheating strategy. Well, if the cheater plays against tit for tat, it will not make much gain because the next moment tit for tat will no longer cooperate with it. But if the cheater plays with them always cooperating, then the cheater can make gain because they're always cooperating. Each time again, he will be a sucker. Each time again, the too nice agent will lose out and the cheater will win. So that means that now you get a kind of a population where most of the agents are playing tit for tat. Some of the agents are being always cooperative. Some of the agents are always cheating. Now, if you think about that, that sounds a little bit like society the way we know it. Most people are willing to cooperate, but on the condition that the other one does the same. So most people are to some degree suspicious if they, if let's say your neighbor asks you something and you lend him your lawnmower, you kind of expect that when you need something, your neighbor will also help you. But if the neighbor, when you ask the neighbor something and the neighbor doesn't give you anything, then you will say, okay, next time he asks me something, I'm not going to give him anything anymore. But of course, there are some what we might call naive people or too good people who will continue helping anyway. And it's those people then that the few cheaters that are in society will take advantage of. So we have a very simple simulation with very simple rules, but the end result is something that kind of looks realistic. So let's make it a little bit more complicated still. We can do like with the cellular automata, we create a space, a two-dimensional space. The different agents are in different cells, they have neighbors, and so they play the game only with their neighbors. What do you see in this kind of simulation? You will see that there are regions where all the agents cooperate, and there are regions where all the agents cheat, and then there are kind of intermediate regions where sometimes they cooperate. Again, that's a not unrealistic view of the world. Most regions, most countries have a regime of cooperation where people trust each other and they cooperate. But occasionally you have so-called failed states like Somalia, where you have the right of the strongest. Whoever manages first to grab something grabs it. Yes?
Don't continuous cheaters essentially self-destruct if to have a region that's only them because they'll never gain anything?
Well, it's not really that it's not so much that they self-destruct, but it depends on how much gain they make. So, yeah, if you require that they should gain something at least, then they will self-destruct. But if you just say that if they gain less than a certain amount, they can still survive, but they don't reproduce, then it depends. It depends on a number of these parameters. But so if we look at it in the world, yeah, occasionally there are regions where there is total chaos and anarchy, and where you have local warlords that will take anything, whatever they can grab, and never give anything back. So it's also not unrealistic. Yeah.
Would you not say that it's not anarchistic but hierarchical because of the power? I mean, anarchy is without hierarchy, and the power systems you're trying to imply are strictly hierarchical because of power.
Well, maybe anarchistic is not the right term, because I mean, I know I have a friend who is an anarchist and who uses complex systems theory to show that anarchism can work. It's more. It's not really power either. It's just cheating. It means we'll see the term later. It's called a free rider. A free rider is somebody who just profits from the effort of others and doesn't give anything in return. Like people who go on the metro without paying. These are called free riders. So there is always space for some cheaters if you are handy enough. Like all these cheating messages you get on email, where they offer you that you will get 1 million euro in your bank account, and then of course you never get the 1 million euro, but they take away your money. So cheaters can survive even in a society that's mostly cooperative. So that's the application, let's say, to social systems. And the interesting thing here is that the scientists use it to understand the evolution of cooperation. How come that if you start with individually selfish agents, that you do get cooperative societies? We can go one step further and look at the evolution of culture. So what is culture? Culture is knowledge or beliefs or behaviors that are transmitted from one agent to another. So again, you could have, let's say, your agents in different cells, and you could have those agents have some form of communication. So the earliest and simplest version of that simulation is one of a person I know, Heylighen, who is a Canadian. Now she's a professor in the US, but she made her PhD here in CLEA at the VUB. So what she did was, each agent in a cell had to solve a problem. Now, what the problem was not important. She had invented some kind of a problem of dance moves, where there were different kind of moves they could make, and depending on how coherent the moves, they would get points. So the idea is you have a problem where you can have better and worse solutions. So now there are two strategies. Each agent individually can try to find out what's the best solution by trial and error. So the agent just tries a solution, and if it doesn't give a good solution, he tries another one, and he tries another one, he tries another one. Or the second strategy was, you look at all your neighbors, so you have 8 neighbors, and you see which one has the best solution. I'll imitate that one. That's more efficient. Instead of having to try out all the possibilities yourself, you just take the best one that your neighbor is using. But now there are two extreme cases. If all the agents would be trying out for themselves, yeah, okay, they would occasionally find better and better solutions, but it would take a very long time before all of them would have found the best solution. The other extreme is all the agents are imitators. That means they start with a random solution and then they just imitate whatever the others are doing. Yeah, in that case, you never will find a better solution. So what Heylighen found was that the system worked best if there were roughly 10% of agents that were trying to do themselves, you might call them innovators, and 90% imitators. So the 10% that were trying to do it themselves occasionally would find a better solution. But then as soon as they found a better solution, most of their neighbors would imitate them, and then most of the neighbors of those neighbors would imitate it, and like that, a good solution would immediately spread over the whole space. And again, that is you might say, a realistic way of how society functions. Most people, when they have a problem, they don't try to solve it themselves. They look around and they see, my father does it like that, or my friend does it like that, or I'm reading in a book and the book says that I should do it like that. Most of the people imitate a solution that they have found. And typically they compare a number of solutions and imitate the best one. But of course, there are also inventors, people who really come up with a new creative solution. So again, using these very simple assumptions, you can make a simulation that teaches you something. You might say that how society works. So this kind of simulation, you can now, of course, make it more sophisticated. You can, for example, say the agents will not imitate just the best one of their neighbors, but you can put them in a kind of a social network. That means that they know some agents better and others less well. And so the better they know an agent, the more they will be inclined to imitate them. So typically people will behave the way their friends do, and not so much like as acquaintances do. If you use that as an imitation rule, the agents imitate the ones that they know best, you will get typically effects like subcultures. That you will get clusters of agents that are all doing the same, but they are doing something different from another cluster with which they don't have much contact. So you can make all kinds of variations that are more or less realistic, and that, in principle, can make you understand how new ideas spread to society. So I'm now at the moment myself writing a paper in which I'm trying to put together a number of these ideas to kind of develop a general model of how new ideas evolve in society. New ideas evolve not just by individual agents inventing an idea and then all the others copying it. No, what typically happens is that each agent finds part of a solution, and then somebody else hears that part of a solution. If that part of a solution fits with a part of a solution that he already had, the two parts will be joined together, and then maybe a third agent may adduce a third part of the solution, and like that you can in principle get complicated theories, stories, ideologies, maybe even religions that are built up bits and pieces coming from different agents, but that then are communicated with others, and you can have all kinds of rules like these types of beliefs will propagate most easily. For example, you would assume, for example, that simple beliefs propagate more easily than complicated ones. Beliefs that are coherent with what agents already believe will propagate more easily than beliefs that are incoherent, etc. So you could, in principle, make a pretty sophisticated simulation of how new ideas evolve in society. So it's one of the things I'm now busy working on, but the basis is already there in these old simulations. So that was a chapter on complex adaptive systems, which means that now I have covered all the chapters where we kind of historically went to the different movements in science that brought up some of these elements of this paradigm of the evolutionary systemic worldview. So in the next chapters, I will try to make a synthesis of that, looking at the most fundamental concepts and the most fundamental principles to try to show how does this complexity evolve. And to start with, we need to go to the very foundation, the very bottom. That means the most primitive, the most simple, the most basic concepts. Now, in the Newtonian worldview, the most basic concepts are material objects. I will use the term in philosophy that is used for these foundations. It's the concept of an ontology. So ontology is a philosophical theory of what is the basis of existence. What is reality composed of? So the Newtonian worldview has a materialist ontology. It assumes that the world is constituted out of pieces of matter. Pieces of matter that move in space and time under the influence of forces. That's all you need. There's nothing more than matter and time. Now, understand emergent properties. It doesn't allow us to understand organization. It doesn't allow us to understand creative evolution where new forms of organization emerge. Because, if things are just bits of matter that move like billiard balls that hit each other, then nothing really new can emerge. So we need to go deeper than that. And the assumption we need to make is against this reductionist assumption. The reductionist assumption is to understand something complex, you analyze it into independent components, different bits, different pieces. We saw that in a systems view of the world, it's not so much the individual pieces that counts, but the way these pieces are coupled. That means the way they are related to each other. So the worldview that I want to propose assumes a relational ontology. Relations are the most fundamental, you might say, building blocks. Relations, things that connect things to each other that make this network of systems and supersystems and subsystems. But relations, it's a very abstract concept that once you start thinking of examples, it gets very complicated, it gets very fuzzy. So I want to reduce the notion of relation to the simplest possible kind of relations. And I propose two elements. One element I call a distinction, the other element I call a connection. So let's start with the distinction. What is a distinction? A distinction simply means that here is the world, everything you could possibly perceive or know, and you split it in two, and you say, this part I call X, whatever X may be, and this part is not X. X could be all the black things, all the material things, all the living things. So if X is all the living things, then not X is everything else that is not alive. So why is that distinction so important? Because without a distinction, I can't say anything about anything. Whenever I speak about something, whenever I perceive something, I'm distinguishing something. Every word is a distinction because every word has one particular meaning which is distinct from everything it is not. Every word I use, let's say black or alive, means that I distinguish whatever is black from whatever is not black. So any possible description must assume distinctions. So, what are some examples of these distinctions? As I said, in language, each word that I use assumes that there is a particular category of things I'm speaking about, and then you can tell me, yes, this is black, or no, this is not black. Yes, this is alive, or no, this is not alive. Yes and no if I'm speaking in terms of epistemology, will be the equivalent of true or false. True, this is black. False, this is black. True and false is again this distinction. In computers, we know that in the end, computers use a binary digits, ones and zeros. The 1 is the equivalent of true, the 0 is the equivalent of false. If I wouldn't have this minimal distinction between a 1 and a 0, well, my computer wouldn't work. All computing is built on distinctions. In logic, we have the same. We speak about a proposition. A proposition is a statement that describes a particular state of affair. This thing is black is a proposition, and that proposition is true or it is false. In mathematics, I will represent it as a set. I will say X is the set of all black things, not X is the complement of that set. That means the set of all the things that are not in the set X. When I'm thinking about topology, which is a branch of mathematics, topology, you speak about insides and outsides. Insides, inside X, outside. An object, let's say that blackboard, everything else is the background. It's called the figure, the thing I perceive, and the background. Yeah.
Is the distinction definitive, as in the last distinction that was made? Because in systems theory, what we saw was that it always had open borders. So could X evolve into not X or?
Yeah, at the moment, I'm just saying at one particular moment, I distinguish X from offset.
Okay.
I'm not saying that X needs to remain not X. That's what we will see later in the course, precisely that there will not be this distinction conservation. But we also need to note that the distinction between X and not X can be sharp, but it can be fuzzy. Fuzzy means, to some degree, I can say that is a tall person of 2 meters 20. That's not a tall person, a person of 1 meter 60. But now I look at a person of 1 meter 80. Is that person tall or not tall? Well, kind of tall, but not very tall. So distinctions can also be fuzzy. That means there can be a degree, like when I'm saying it's black or it's not black. Well, this thing is not really black. It's more kind of dark gray. So it can be fuzzy. So distinctions can be fuzzy. So the distinctions is something we will find in any representation, in any worldview, because without distinction you can't do anything. So in the Newtonian worldview, we find distinctions because the Newtonian worldview starts by analyzing everything into objects, which eventually are consisting of particles, and each particle is a distinct thing that is at a distinct position at a distinct moment of time. So distinctions in the Newtonian worldview, that's the basis. So we need something more than distinctions. What we need more is what I call connections. So why a connection? Because whenever I start saying something non-trivial, saying black doesn't give you any information. This is black means there is something, and that something is black. For example, let's say this iPad, which is a distinction, is black. That's a connection. A distinction, to make sense, should imply some other distinction. Some other distinction should follow from it. Let's take, for example, the category of all bananas. I distinguish between bananas and other fruits. What can I say about bananas? I can say that bananas are curved. They have a curvy shape. If it is a banana, then it is curved. But I can also say, if it is a banana, it is fruit. These are what I would call hard distinctions, hard connections. If it is a banana, it's always curved. If it is a banana, it's always fruit. Now I could also say, if it is a banana, it is yellow. That's not always the case. That's what I would call a soft distinction. Given a banana, it's probable that it's yellow, but there are green bananas, there are brown bananas, sometimes there are even pink bananas. So a connection is something that, given the first distinction, indicates another distinction, one more distinction. And that is a principle that is very nicely, what was very nicely formulated by one of the cyberneticians, Gregory Bateson. He called it a difference that makes a difference. So the difference is the original distinction. That makes a difference, that means, given that difference, I can derive some other difference from it. Imagine the opposite, a difference that does not make a difference. I can invent some random words. Let's for example, invent the word I don't know.
You?
Flat. And you will ask me, yeah, what is a flat? Well, a flat is a flat. Yeah, but how does a flat look? Well, a flat looks like a flat. Well, what properties is it? Well, it's different that does not make a difference. I can't say anything about what a flat is. It's a non-existing concept. It's a meaningless concept. So for any concept, that means for any distinction to be meaningful, it should point to some other distinction, which in turn should point to some other distinction, which in turn should point to some other distinction. So it's part of this network of distinctions that are all connected to each other. Yes?
Doesn't that look a bit like the essential and accidental properties of Aristotle?
Well, because he speaks about essential and accidental, yeah, you might say the essential ones would be the hard ones, and the accidental ones could be the soft ones. Yeah.
Is it then similar to the intertextuality of Derrida?
Well, to some degree, another example of this principle is a dictionary. You look up the definition of a word, and you find a number of other words. And then you look up the definition of each of these words. Again, you find other words. And if you do that long enough, you will get back to your first word. Which means that each word is defined by other words, which are defined by other words, and all the words kind of are in one big network. So, and in some of my papers, I've called it the bootstrapping principle. It's bootstrapping in the sense that the whole thing is lifting itself out with its own bootstrap. A distinction is defined by all the other distinctions, which are defined by all the other distinctions, but you need more than one distinction, otherwise there is no sense in saying anything. So let's now, to make that clear, go to the opposite. Let's assume that there is a difference that does not make a difference. So I gave this example of the flat, but here we see it's kind of obvious that that doesn't make a difference. But I'll give you a philosophical thought experiment, a very famous thought experiment. It's called the zombie thought experiment, and it was proposed by a philosopher called David Chalmers, who's speaking about consciousness. And so what Chalmers tries to understand is why is consciousness so difficult to understand? And to show why it's so difficult, he imagined that there are two types of beings: normal human beings and what he calls zombies. And nowadays, these kind of zombies are called philosophical zombies, to make clear that we're not speaking about the zombies from the horror movies. So a zombie is defined by Chalmers as being exactly the same as a human being, except that that zombie does not have consciousness. What does it mean exactly the same? It means that You cannot do any scientific or other observation that would allow you to distinguish a zombie from a human. If you look at the brain of the zombie, it looks exactly the same as the brain of a normal being. If you ask the zombie unconscious, he will answer, yes, I'm conscious, just like any normal human being would do. If you do any psychological experiment on the zombie will react just the way a normal human being would do. But the zombie doesn't have consciousness. So what's the conclusion of Chalmers? Consciousness is a hard problem. Hard problem, in his definition, is a problem that science cannot solve. But look what he has actually done. He has created a problem where there isn't any. He has defined a category like the flood, a difference that doesn't make a difference. The difference between humans and zombies doesn't make any difference. So where is the problem? The problem is that he made up a problem where there wasn't any problem, which does not mean that consciousness isn't a difficult problem. But consciousness is a problem you can look at scientifically because there is a difference between somebody who is conscious and somebody who is not conscious. It's pretty obvious when somebody is unconscious. There are quite a lot of differences between a conscious state and a non-conscious state. So you can do all kinds of observations and experiments about it. But assuming that there are these creatures called zombies that do not have consciousness, but otherwise are exactly the same as everybody else, doesn't make sense, because otherwise I might as well believe that all of you are zombies and that I'm the only one who's not a zombie here. How do I know? So the zombie is an example of a difference that does not make a difference. And actually, there was another philosopher that had formulated a similar principle, and that is Leibniz. He spoke about the principle of the identity of the indiscernibles, or the identity of the indistinguishables. His idea is, if there are two objects and you cannot make any distinction between the one and the other, then those two objects are actually one object. If whatever I can say about category X, I can also say about category Y and vice versa, then X and Y are the same thing. And that is a very useful principle, because indeed, start by assuming that there are zombies and that there are humans, and then come to the conclusion that there isn't any difference, then the logical conclusion is, well, zombies and humans are the same thing. There just is one category. So that's the principle of the difference that makes a difference. Why do we need that? Because we need to have these two elements of our ontology, the distinctions, that means the differences, and the connections. Without connections, distinctions don't make sense. And vice versa, without distinctions, the connections don't make sense, because to connect two things, there must be two things, which means there must be a difference. You need to make the assumption that there is a distinction before you can say anything. So that's, let's say, the basis of the relational ontology. You need to have distinctions, you need to have connections, and these two define each other. The one is needed for the other. Okay, that's a good moment for a 10 minutes break. Well, the basis for making an intelligible claim. Yes. Well, the category.